It's been a great week, hasn't it? I came to Israel in 2010 with Tony Crisp, and he brought the Eucharist faculty, a good number of the faculty and some of the staff and a number of students. And I was just overwhelmed with the experience. And I remember when we got back, I thought, I want to go back there as soon as possible again. And I want Eucharist to be involved in this, and what Dr. Crisp is doing over here, and his passion for bringing pastors over, for bringing students over here to learn the Bible in its original context, the geographical, historical, cultural, linguistic contexts. I was on board really quick, and I think that many of you are, if you're not on board already, I think you're on your way. And tomorrow will be a wonderful day as well, as we look at some of the most important parts of this trip. When we go to the garden, we go to Golgotha, and we see what Jesus went through on behalf of us. And what I'd like to do this evening is at least try to accomplish two things, possibly three, depending on time. Is in anticipation of tomorrow, I'd like to try to take you there, even though we haven't been there yet. But I want to take you there, and then tomorrow this will all be more real. But I want to take you to some of the places that we're going to go to tomorrow, and sort of prepare you so that you can get not only where you have a visual image of that when you're there, but you'll have the information behind that, so it will bring it together and perhaps even close some more of those gaps that I've been talking about, that we've been trying to do while we're here. And one of those concerns the Last Supper that took place in the upper room with Jesus and his disciples. I think the best way to approach this is to look at prayer. To look at prayer, and I'm speaking right out of the notes tonight, so you may already know what I'm going to say about this. But I assume everybody here, before you begin to eat a meal, that you say a blessing, and that's what we do, isn't it? And some of the blessings that we say, I often wonder how much reflection we do with respect to the words that we utter. Here are a couple common ones. Dear Lord, bless this food to the nourishment of our bodies. You ever prayed something like that? Or Father, bless this food and may it give us strength to do your work. I've prayed those prayers most of my life. But have you ever thought carefully about what you're asking God to bless? I mean, look at some of the food we're actually asking God to bless and to make it somehow nourishable to our bodies. I mean, think about what we say, what we pray, what we ask God to do. What I'd like to do is talk about the fact that the prayers that we pray around meals are not only unbiblical, but no Jew would have ever prayed these prayers. What am I talking about? I'm talking about when we ask God to bless the food. That's what I'm talking about. When we read, for example, in the Psalms, when David is issuing a psalm to God, what does he say? Does he say, "Bless me, Lord, O my soul"? Is that what he says? No. He says, "Bless the Lord, O my soul." The blessing is directed to God. It's directed to God. In fact, the word bless in Hebrew prayers means expressing thanks and praise to God. That's what it means to say a blessing. You're thanking God for something that He's already given you, you see. In fact, on the Sabbath, the Shabbat, which we were here when that was starting, when the candles are lit, and the time of Shabbat is beginning at sunset, there is bread and wine that is brought out. And there are prayers that are prayed. And here's a couple examples. On Friday evenings, as they begin to sip the wine from the cup, they pray this prayer. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who creates the fruit of the vine. When they break the bread, they pray, Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. You see, they don't ask God to bless the food or the wine. No, the blessing is directed to God in thanksgiving for the provision. He's already blessed us with this stuff. We don't ask Him to bless it. He's already done it. So we're blessing God. We're thanking Him for what He has given to us. And there's no doubt that these are the kinds of prayers that Jesus would have prayed. Now, why is this such a big deal? Why am I drawing your attention to this? Not just because our prayers aren't quite right, but because this has caused a great deal of confusion. And I would suggest to you that it has affected our view, hopefully not our view here in this room, but it has affected the view of many Christians with regard to what we call the communion, what the Roman Catholics call the Eucharist. Now, this is a big deal. It's a big deal. The Roman Catholic doctrine behind the Eucharist is called transubstantiation. It's different from the Lutheran doctrine called consubstantiation, but I would just want to focus in on transubstantiation. And the belief here is that when the priest says the blessing over the host, over the bread and wine, over the wafers and the wine, that it is transformed into the body and blood of Christ. That's what the belief is in Roman Catholic theology. Now let me tell you something. I know something about Roman Catholics because I spent a lot of time with Roman Catholics. 10 years. I spent 10 years working on 2 graduate degrees at 2 different Roman Catholic institutions. And while I was at the first one at the Franciscan University of Steubenville, there was a concerted effort by the people that I began to get to know to try to convert me to Catholicism. Now, I was very open to what they had to say. You know, I don't want to be so dogmatic that I can't see what the truth is. I want to believe something because it's true, not because it's a tradition that's been passed down to me or I was raised a certain way. I want to know what's true because that's what I want to believe. I don't want to believe something that's false. None of this willful ignorance works for me. Okay, so I'm open-minded about these things. I wanted to know, so I told him, "Give me the arguments. I want to hear what you have to say." And I listened, and I was not convinced, obviously, or I wouldn't be here today. I developed a friendship with another student there, who also. He was Roman Catholic, but he did not necessarily believe all the doctrines of the Catholic Church. So he wouldn't have been considered Orthodox, but he nonetheless considered himself Roman Catholic. And for example, he didn't like the doctrines of Mary that the Catholic Church taught. He didn't like those. But we struck up a friendship, and he asked me if I didn't even invite him. He asked me what kind of church I went to, and I told him, evangelical church, and he said, "Do you guys have Bible studies there?" I said, "Yeah, Sunday nights we have Bible studies." He says, "Would you mind if I attended?" I said, "No, not at all." And he told me that he loved the way evangelical churches studied the Bible. So you don't really get that sort of thing in the Catholic Church. And so he would come every Sunday night and to the Bible studies at church. He'd even hang out afterwards and talk to my pastor and I at the church. And I remember one time I asked him, I said, "What is it that's keeping you in Roman Catholicism? Why don't you just leave? I mean, you got problems with the things they're teaching. You like to come here. You know, why don't you just get out of that?" And his answer was very interesting. He said, "The reason I stay Catholic is because of the Eucharist. Because of the Eucharist." He said, "I cannot deny the experience I have when I partake of the body and blood of Christ. You see, this is the centerpiece of Roman Catholic teaching, soteriology, really. Ironically, even though I say that, ironically, over 60%, the last time I checked, over 60% of Roman Catholics do not believe in transubstantiation. Over 60%. So there's some doubt about this as well. But in order to be fair to how Catholics present this doctrine, because I used to think, rather ignorantly at the time, I used to think, well, the easiest way to debunk this view is just to get a sample of that wine and that wafer after it's been blessed and test it for DNA. If it doesn't have human DNA in it, then that just debunks the whole thing, you know. Well, they're a little bit smarter than that. They've created up what I call an unfalsifiable teaching, because that is not going to work with the way they have it set up. In fact, part of the word, transubstantiation, is the key to how they present this. And they borrow from Thomas Aquinas' teaching, who was an Aristotelian, and he uses Aristotle's philosophy to actually come up with a defense for this doctrine. So how does it work? Well, what actually changes? I mean, when the priest says a blessing, you look at it, it's the same. If you were to take a bite of that wafer before and then after, it would taste exactly the same. What's happened? The substance has changed, but the accidents have remained the same. That's what they say. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's a part of the philosophy of Aristotle where he talks about accidental qualities versus a substance. A substance would be a single entity, a subsisting thing. Accidents are qualities of that thing that are not necessary to make it what it is. It would be like hair color, or even having hair. Like a human being is a substance, right? But things like hair color, things like weight, things, you know, these sorts of things are accidental qualities. It's not necessary that in order for a human substance to be, that it has to have a particular color of hair, or a particular height, a particular weight, and so on. Those are accidental qualities. It means they're not necessary to make the thing what it is. Okay, they can change, and the substance remains the same. So here, what they're saying is the accidental qualities stay the same. So it still looks, tastes, it feels like a wafer, looks, tastes, and feels like wine, but the substance is what has changed, but it retains the accidental qualities of what it was before the priest said the blessing. So that's how, in a nutshell, that's how they present this. And of course, like I said, it's unfalsifiable. And I don't know about you, as I'm a skeptic, okay? And if someone presents to me an unfalsifiable position, then I get very, very skeptical about it, because there's no way to test it. What's the basis for it then? Well, because they say so. That's why. They say so. And when you get pushed back to the Scriptures, which is what I'm doing now, that's where we have to try to find the answer to this. So what exactly is going on? What was happening at the Lord's Supper? Well, at the Lord's Supper, Jesus was doing this in conjunction with the Passover. He was basically doing what he said he was going to do. Remember, he said, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Those are two Hebrew concepts there, because abolishing the law meant to misinterpret it. Misinterpret the law. To fulfill the law meant to interpret it correctly. Okay? So Jesus is doing that very thing in the upper room with his disciples. He's fulfilling the law, and he's showing what those symbols ultimately are pointing to. No Jew would have thought of the bread and the wine at the Passover as being anything but symbolic of something that happened in the past. Jesus is showing its fulfillment in the present when he says, he takes the bread and says, this is my body, takes the wine and says, this is my blood. Okay? So from the Jewish perspective, I don't believe that it could be said that the Jew would have actually, the disciple sitting there would have actually thought what the Catholics think, and that is that this was just, when he said that, it became his body and his blood. I just can't imagine that any Hebrew-minded person would think that. That would be crazy. That would be what some of the critics of Christianity said about the early church, and that is that they were cannibals. Okay? That would have been repulsive to any Hebrew-minded person. So the question that arises is this: where did this notion of transubstantiation come from? When you study church history, it's there. It's early on. It's pretty early when you look at it. At least it seems to be. It's a matter of interpretation, but it seems to be quite early that you find this. Well, I've alluded to this before, but one of the things we need to bear in mind historically is that there was a concerted effort to sever Christianity from its Jewish and Hebraic roots. That began in the middle of the 2nd century. 135 AD, Jerusalem was destroyed. There was no longer a mother church there in Jerusalem. Okay, it was gone. So now you have these competing groups that are trying to get the center, political center of Christianity elsewhere. Rome and Constantinople were competing. Okay, I talked about that a little before when we were at Caesarea Philippi, so I won't go into that again. But that's a part of the background for understanding this. The Catholic Church has been known for its syncretism. That is, when Christianity would go into an area, that they would absorb some of the pagan teachings that were in these areas. Prominent teaching in the Greco-Roman world was this idea of eating the god. Okay, it's a prominent thing. In your notes, I point out that Will Durant talks about these Mediterranean mystery religions that serve as the origin of the concept of eating the god. He talks about this bull god that existed, and that he says often the food was thought to take on by sanctification the powers of the god, and were magically conveyed to the communicant. Okay, and there's these Hellenic cults that existed that practiced this. And this kind of thinking was quite prominent. They would think that eating certain things, they would be getting the power of the god inside of them. Drinking certain things would get the power of a god inside of them. In fact, so dominant was this mentality that even in the Middle Ages it was prominent. We find, for example, the physicians of the time prescribing some very odd things to sick people. For example, someone has a mental disorder, and they, obviously we have to be a little sympathetic to their knowledge of the time, but nonetheless, this illustrates the point I'm making. Someone has a mental disorder. So what would the doctor prescribe? The physician would prescribe that since the problem seems to be in the brain, the person needs to eat some healthy brain tissue. And so they would literally prescribe as a remedy for this, eating a dead person's brain who was mentally sane and okay. And that eating that tissue would give the power that was in it to you, into your brain, so you would take on that power. Okay? So I just give that one illustration. I mean, there are a lot of these examples you can find in history. But I just wanted you to see how this crept into Christian teaching. I mean, it was a very easy thing to see taking place. We find it all over the place back then. So it seems clear to me that transubstantiation is actually borrowing from these pagan sources and deviates from the Hebraic Passover origins of the Last Supper. Now there's one passage of Scripture that I want you to take a look at, because sometimes this is used, and I'm talking about in the Lord's Supper, and you can find this in Matthew and Luke. I'm not going to look at one specific reference, but the question we have to ask is, because it sounds like this in some English translations, did Jesus bless the food or did he bless God at the Lord's Supper? Now, I already have said that I think clearly that he would have prayed the typical Passover prayer, which means he would have directed the blessing to God and not the food. But in the biblical texts that describe the Last Supper, Jesus is said to have blessed it, broke it, and gave it. That's how some English translations read. So that sounds like he was blessing the food, because it says he blessed it, broke it, and gave it. Well, if you look in the original Greek behind the text, behind the translation, we notice that there's no direct object at all. The it is not there in the Greek. Okay, some translator has added that for whatever reason. Perhaps he thought that it sounded better that way, or perhaps he's putting his own theology into the text, which does happen, unfortunately, sometimes. The text actually reads, he blessed, he broke, and gave. So what did he bless? He blessed God. He broke the bread and gave the bread, but he blessed God, I would suggest to you, is the right way to read it. So in its Hebraic context, the blessing would clearly have been directed to God and not the food. It would have been consistent with what we see in Hebrew prayers, throughout. Okay? So this becomes, in short, a way to I think, respond to the Roman Catholic teaching of transubstantiation. Now, when we talk about consubstantiation, I don't really want to get into that. I have less of a problem with that, but I still don't think it's correct. I still think it's probably better to understand this as symbolic, just as the Passover elements were symbolic. I think Jesus was, when he said, "Do this in remembrance of me," the idea of remembering, which we find quite prominent in the Old Testament. God says, "I will remember your sins no more," or "I will forget things." This idea. We really need to understand that more in terms of it applying not to a mental act, but to the actual act itself. Which is why when Jesus says, "This do in remembrance of me," doing it is remembering him. We're reenacting it in what he did in the upper room with his disciples. Okay, so it's symbolic. I think that's we as Protestants, Baptists, whatever we are, evangelicals. I think that we've got this right. It seems to make sense when we consider it in its context. Okay. I want to talk about the atonement here as well, but before I move on, I want to see if there's a question that anyone might have about that. Yes, sir.
I'm not sure if here in the United States, if they have the Easter time, there is a bun that's used. But in my home country, Trinidad, we use around Easter, it's called a hot cross bun, and they would just put a cross on the bun and they would use it around Easter time. Mm-hmm. And I came to understand, my earlier readings, that the bun was a pagan ritual, and the Roman Catholics, or the Catholic Church, just put the cross as a way of sympathy.
Yep. There's a lot of that in Catholic thought. I mean, the doctrines of Mary, I think, came from paganism as well. The Virgin Mary and her sinlessness and ascension into heaven. Immaculate Conception. Immaculate Conception came from the Franciscans, which, interestingly, I don't want to get way off track here, but interestingly, the Thomists rejected it because Thomas Aquinas thought it was unbiblical. But then they were forced to accept it because the Pope made his the first infallible declaration by a Pope occurred in the 1800s, and it concerned that doctrine. He could not get the Thomists on board with this view, the Immaculate Conception, which, by the way, is not Jesus' conception, it's Mary's. Mary was born sinless, so that Jesus could be born sinless. Yeah. I don't get this, but anyway. That was an ex cathedra statement by a pope in the 1800s. It's the first one. It's the first time that ever happened. And now every time a pope writes an encyclical, the conservative Orthodox Catholics consider that to be infallible. The more moderate liberal Catholics don't. Because I went to both kinds of schools. I went to a conservative and a liberal Catholic university. It's interesting to see the differences about that. Anything else on it? Yes?
So in the consecration, not consecration, but in the communion, we're not actually saying, bless this bread, bless this particular wine. We're saying, actually, bless the one who brought it to us life.
Well, that would be consistent with the Passover, the way, yeah. See, what's happened is the mistake in thinking that you're asking God to bless the food.
Right.
This has fed into the whole Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation. And when the priest says the blessing over the bread and the wine, it becomes the body and blood of Christ in their theology, you see. That bringing the blessing down onto it. But I'm saying, and I think it's partly due to a misinterpretation of Jesus praying in the upper room at Passover. I think he would have prayed a Passover prayer. You know, the text indicates that he didn't ask for a blessing on the bread. He's blessing God for giving the bread. I mean, that would have been the prayer. I would suggest that he would have prayed. And as it's recorded in the New Testament, I think that's clearly what he's doing. That pattern, bless, broke, and gave. He blessed, broke, and gave. I mean, that's how the Passover worked. You bless God, break the bread, and it's passed around. I mean, that's how it works. He was doing the Passover with them, you see.
I think it's also consistent with when he fed 2 fish, 5 loaves of bread. The Bible says he held it up and he gave thanks. To God.
Yes.
The same thing with raising Lazarus from the grave. He gave God thanks.
Right.
Before he did that, so it seems to be all consistent.
Yes, indeed. So next time you say a blessing before you eat, how are you going to pray?
Bless God.
Yes, that's right. Well, maybe I better not share that anecdote with you.
So we have to change history of society, right?
Well, if you really care about being accurate, about doing things right, then I think we perhaps should adjust our prayers so that they are more biblical. Don't you?
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. If we have to be light, and people have a history of functioning in darkness because of their own ignorance,
Mhm.
then we have an obligation to
Yeah.
speak the truth.
Yeah.
I agree.
There are 2 little books. I forgot to bring them down with me. I do have them with me if you want to see what they look like. 2 little paperback books that are published by Engedi Resource Center, which is in Michigan. One of them is called Hearing the Words of Jesus. I can't. They're both in your bibliography. Lois Tovert and I forget the other. I shouldn't even be saying this because I can't get it right.
Are they in our bibliography?
They're in your bibliography. If you want to see the books, I have them up in my room. I'll bring them on the bus tomorrow and show you so you can write down the information. But they're in your bibliography. But I can't get the name right, so I better show them to you. Really good books that talk about certain phrases and teachings that Jesus gave, and from a Hebraic perspective. And one of the sections in one of those books, deals with prayers, Jewish prayers, and how Jesus would have prayed, and so on. Well, now I'd like to talk a little bit about one of the things that we're going to experience tomorrow. We are going to do communion tomorrow, by the way, in the Garden Tomb area. But we're also going to go look at Golgotha, the place of the skull. Okay? And I don't want to give anything away about what you're going to see there, because I learned something when I was there 2 years ago that I didn't know. And I don't want to give that away. I mean, actually, the way this place looks is just, It's not like the movies at all. Nothing like the movies. They don't get it right in the movies. But I'll leave that for tomorrow for Tony to surprise you with that. But what I would like to talk about is this idea of substitutionary atonement. I'd like to place it in its social, cultural context with you a little bit. And the reason why I'd like to do this is because as an apologist, one of the things that I encounter in critics and skeptics, among critics and skeptics, is how they go after this whole notion of substitutionary atonement. And one of the things that they misunderstand is they apply the wrong social, cultural concepts to it, and so which makes their criticisms invalid. We live in what's called a guilt culture. Okay, most cultures are not guilt cultures, and most cultures function under what are called honor and shame. Okay, that's different. When you think of shame, you might be thinking of guilt. No, it's not that at all. This is about social status. Okay, we have a hard time with this because we have removed all of that kind of stuff in the United States. I mean, it's still roughly there, but keep in mind before the modern era, before the United States began to remove these various statuses, like you have the aristocracy and the peasantry and that sort of thing. That's a part of it. Pedigree was important. Okay, honor was something that if you came from an honorable family, you would inherit that honor, but you could mess it up if you did something stupid. But this is the background for understanding the power of the atonement. What God was trying to communicate. Remember, Dr. Crispus said a couple of times, the timing of Christ coming into the world was not an accident. It was planned by God to be at a certain time, at a certain place, in a certain culture, a culture that had within it the ability to communicate the message that God wanted to be communicated in the strongest terms possible. Okay? And so the timing was impeccable when Christ came into the world. You have a very strong concept of honor and shame that existed. And so that's how this whole thing is couched within that. Okay? Let me give you one example. The parable of the prodigal son. Remember, the younger son comes to his father and he says, I want my portion of the inheritance. Now, normally when did that happen? Yeah. So this was a very dishonoring thing for this son to do. You know what he was saying to his father? I wish you were dead. You see. And this is a parable about repentance. Okay? But this is a terrible, shameful thing. He was shaming his father. He was shaming his heritage when he did that. And, this is sometimes hard for us to get because we don't live in this kind of society. We do things that the people in the first century would have never understood. I thought how dishonoring these modern day Westerners are. But anyway, let me try to give you a couple points about this. In order to understand the doctrine of the atonement properly, we need to recognize how this fits into the worldview in ancient Israel. First of all, God is in the position of highest authority, of the highest good, and is therefore a being of the highest personal honor. He is the most honorable being. Okay? He has the highest and most amount of honor. And so the concept of sin needs to be understood, therefore, as an insult to God's honor. Okay? It's like a complete disregard for His rule and authority, and it would have been called an honor offense, just like the prodigal son. It's an honor offense. Okay, so that's what how sin would have been conceived of in this way. And so anyone who commits a sin they're degrading God's honor and status. Why? Because honor belongs rightly to God, and therefore it must be restored. When you dishonor God, that has to be restored. It'd be like dishonoring your father. Somehow that has to be restored. And by the way, these weren't like personal, private matters. And the societies didn't function that way like ours does. What stays in our home, what happens in our home stays in our home. What happens in my bedroom is no one else's business. That's the way we talk in the United States. No, not in that ancient culture. There was a communal culture, like I mentioned before. And so issues of honor and shame were public. You couldn't hide this kind of stuff. In fact, when people made declarations, they made it out loud in a public way. You ever notice that when the Apostle Paul is addressing sin in some of the epistles to the churches, he addresses it in a public way. This needs to happen publicly because it's not just to you. This is not a private sin. I brought this up in a church that I was an elder in one time. There was a lady in the church, and she was a troublemaker. Okay, and we were having an elders meeting, trying to figure out how to resolve the problem. And here I found out in the midst of this discussion that this lady had committed adultery 10 years ago. 10 years ago, before I got there. All right, and it had never been dealt with. And in fact, I talked to her personally about it later, and she told me, well, I confessed that already. I asked for forgiveness. I said, to whom? She said, to God. I said, well, what about the church? You committed adultery with someone in the church. You see, this is a public thing. Now that strikes us as being, oh no, you can't do that. You're going to guilt that person. It is biblical. It would have been clearly seen and understood and been the right thing to do. This is a church matter. We're a community. We're all part of the same body of Christ, you see. And when we let these things go, it festers. She had been a constant problem and troublemaker in the church. And I told the other elders, I said, this was never dealt with way back here. And she's still causing problems. It doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman, but if it's not dealt with in the right way, he's afraid. One of the elders that was there when this was going on, he had since left the elder board, but I asked him about it, and he said, well, I think the consensus was that because she had family members in the church, if we tried to deal with her, then we might lose a bunch of people. They would leave the church, because that's pretty much what happens whenever a church tries to apply church discipline. Unfortunately, people just go find another church, and you know how it works. Anyway, so I'm just trying to get this sense to you how prominent this honor-shame motif is. So God's proper... Oh, and by the way, two kinds of honor. Just let me point them out to you. Acquired honor and inherent honor. Okay? The second type, that inherent honor, was something that you would get because of who you were by nature. Okay? I've mentioned this before. Let me say it again. Matthew is doing exactly this, trying to show that Christ has this kind of honor with his genealogy, with the Magi coming, not the shepherds, but the Magi coming, bringing those gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. You see, he's writing his gospel because he wants people to see, he wants Jews to see that Christ has inherent honor. Okay? He's the Son of God. He's of the same nature as God, you see. Interesting that Matthew does not have the shepherds coming to see Jesus. Why? That would not have been a very honorable thing. Why? Because the shepherds were scum in the first century. They were lowlifes. They weren't trustworthy people. Luke doesn't have a problem with the shepherds coming because he's not writing with the same purpose that Matthew is. Matthew doesn't have shepherds coming because shepherds were down here in this social status. There was no honor for shepherds. Okay, and by the way, ladies, there was no honor for women. And how do I know that? Well, because if you look, you'll see that they simply did not have that. They sometimes were treated like property, and they could not testify in a court of law. They just weren't trustworthy. But notice who Luke has coming as the first recipients of the message of the birth of Christ. Who's he have come? Shepherds. Low social status. Who are the first witnesses to the resurrection? Women. Low social status. You see. Now, if you were making up a story and you wanted people to believe it, would you have shepherds coming? Would you have women being witnesses, the first witnesses to the resurrection? Probably not. That actually is a proof for the truth of the accounts that we have in the gospel. That's an embarrassing thing. And historians use that as a means for determining whether something is historically credible, because it sounds honest. Why else would you do that unless it really happened, unless you're reporting the truth? Because you certainly wouldn't want to do that if you were just making something up, you see. So even God, of course, has this kind of honor, this inherent honor, but he also has the other kind of honor. I mean, you can have both. You can have acquired honor. Acquired honor has to do with your deeds and your authority. That's what it pertains to. Even if it belongs to God, it can be taken away. Okay? You need to understand that. That doesn't sound right to us, but it's how they thought. Okay? Which is why, by the way, and here I'm jumping around, I know, but I want you to get these illustrations. That's behind what was going on Mount Carmel as well, I would suggest to you. God is showing who He is. He is in control. He's in control of the weather patterns, not Baal, the storm god. And He is the one that has this acquired honor. It's showing that He deserves this kind of honor, this kind of trust. As Dr. Crispus said, that's what faith is in the Bible. It's trust. Okay? It's trusting. And so how do you know whether someone's trustworthy? They have to prove it through their deeds. They have to show that they're honorable, that you can enter into this client-patron relationship, and that's how faith was understood back then, client-patron relationship. I have a whole section in your notes on that, by the way. And this is why the apostles preached the way they did about the risen Christ, because the resurrection overcomes the stigma of the cross. Now, what is the stigma of the cross? Well, the stigma of the cross is that crucifixion was intended to bring a person down to the lowest level possible. It was to shame a person as much as possible. It was actually referred to as a status degradation ritual. It was designed to humiliate in every way, including the symbolic pinioning of the hands and legs, signifying a loss of power. This is from Melina, who is in your bibliography as well, in social science commentary, signifying a loss of power and loss of ability to control the body in various ways, including befouling oneself with excrement. Yes, the positioning of the arms and the legs was intentional so that you lost control of yourself. And people hanging on crosses was not a pretty sight. It's not a pretty sight. Even the fact that Jesus was scourged before the crucifixion, the crown of thorns put on His head. And I would suggest to you that the Mel Gibson movie is not an accurate picture of that. It was bad, but it wasn't that bad. No one could have survived what Mel Gibson put put Christ through in that movie before they got to the cross. But nonetheless, the image of that person hanging on the cross was a terrible image. Okay? They used it as a way to frighten people into submission. You know, and they put these people on crosses outside of the city gates so that people coming in would see as a warning sign, this is what happens when you're bad. This is what happens when you don't do what we tell you. So Jesus is hanging on this cross. He's bloody. He's befouling himself. As horrible as that, it pains me to say that sort of thing. This is what he's going through. And you see the faint image of a human being on that cross. What does God want us to see when we see that image? I would suggest to you, He wants us to see what sin looks like. A marred human image, barely recognizable. The image of God has been marred because of sin. You can see that there's a human there, but it's terribly, terribly distorted. That's what sin does. It distorts and it dishonors God. And part of understanding the crucifixion, substitutionary atonement, is recognizing that God is the most honorable being. It requires shame and punishment for the one who has dishonored Him. And this is, Christ is bearing our shame and punishment on the cross. And the image that the cross presents to us is so horrible and at such a low level that it becomes foolishness. Paul says, the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness. It's shocking, actually, terribly shocking that this should happen. In fact, let me read to you some quotes from some critics of Christianity. Let's see here. This is, let me try to find the one I want here. Celsus, an ancient pagan critic of Christianity, writes, "But if Jesus is really so great, He ought, in order to display His divinity, to have disappeared suddenly from the cross." Okay, now why is he saying that sort of thing? Well, because of what crucifixion represented in the ancient world. The Apostle Paul says the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness. Justin Martyr, who was an early church father, writes in his first apology, "They say that our madness consists in the fact that we put a crucified man in second place after the unchangeable and eternal God." He's responding to the critics of the day. Okay, this was a hard pill to swallow. In fact, crucifixion itself was, let me read you a quote from, let's see here. Here it is, from Hegel. "Crucifixion was an utterly offensive affair, obscene in the original sense of the word." It was obscene. In fact, J.P. Holding says that very few ancient writers described it because it was so terrible. In fact, the best picture we have of it is in the New Testament, you see. And so, looking at it that way, I think we begin to see that God was using a symbol that was so powerful in the ancient world to communicate what sin, how sin dishonors God. You know, that it would have such a profound effect, not because of the crucifixion, but because of the results of it later, namely the resurrection, which basically shows that God, the greatest, most honorable being, is raising this crucified individual from the dead who has undergone a status degradation ritual, showing that God has honored that, you see. Okay, let me try to crystallize what I'm getting at here. What I'm saying is that if you really wanted to start a religion, you would not go around preaching about a crucified God. It wouldn't work. So what is it that made Christianity successful? It was the resurrection. Without the resurrection, Christianity should not have even gotten off the ground. It should have died, you see. In fact, thinking about it this way actually provides proof or evidence that the resurrection's true. Why would these guys be going out preaching the resurrection given the social status of crucifixion of the person that they're preaching? You see. I have a number of books in your bibliography from James Patrick Holding. One of them I didn't put in there, but it might be one you want to look at. He has one on the resurrection that is similar that's in there. It's titled The Impossible Faith. The subtitle is How Not to Start an Ancient Religion. And he goes through all these things. This is one of them, one of many. First of all, you don't preach a crucified God. You don't have women being witnesses for the resurrection. I mean, he goes through all these things. It's got to be God behind this. Otherwise, there's no way this would work in the social setting of the first century. So, Jesus, the crucifixion, understanding it as the shame, and by the way, that's what is emphasized throughout the New Testament. What does Hebrews 12 say? He endured the cross, despising the shame, you see. And we have that concept of shame sort of sprinkled throughout the New Testament. And a lot of times it's quotations from the Old Testament that are being brought in, by a writer. And it concerns us not having to be ashamed, you see. The shame has been taken away from us because as sinners, we deserve it. We have shamed the most honorable being. And so I want you, this is what I want you to see in background information when we go there. And you'll have a better picture of how this worked. And like I said, you'll be surprised because it's not what I first, as growing up and watching movies and stuff, I thought it might look like. It doesn't look like that at all. In fact, where the crosses were, not where in the movies, that's not where they were. I don't want to steal Tony's thunder tomorrow, so you'll see, and I think you'll be very much impressed with that. Okay? Any questions about that? How are we doing on time, by the way? I don't have...
2 minutes on 9.
Okay, yes, sir.
I just had a question about, at the Areopagus, Mars Hill,
Mm-hmm.
when Paul preached the resurrection, that's when
Yes.
some Greeks said, we want to hear more about this, but others said, oh, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, they scoffed at him when he mentioned the resurrection, yeah.
so for the Jews, crucifixion was the stumbling block because it's a shameful thing. So
Mhm.
could you say something about why the Greeks thought
Yeah.
that resurrection was
Sure.
ridiculous?
Absolutely. In fact, this is in your notes as well. The reason is that the Greek idea that was very influential was this notion that our bodies are evil, that what human beings essentially are our souls. Okay, this is Plato's view, Socrates and Plato. We're souls trapped in the prison of our bodies. Salvation, you can call it that, salvation, deliverance from the prison of the body was death, where you would ascend back into the realm of the souls and be free from that prison. Okay, they believed in Plato taught the immortality of the soul. It was the idea that there was this realm of souls that existed, and one of these souls did something wrong, and they got popped down and put into the prison of the body. Okay, so getting released from that prison of the body is the idea of salvation to the Greek. All right, so when Paul starts talking about the resurrection in Acts 17, and they begin to scoff at him, because this just runs counter to their way of thinking. Why would you want to get put back into that prison? You see, so they scoff at him when he brings that up. You see, so that's part of the mentality, behind the Greek mind. in the way that they would hear that, the way that they would see it. So, yeah, that's not the Hebrew view. It's not. I don't believe it's the view of the Bible at all. I think the Bible teaches we're soul-body unities. We're not these souls that are living inside of bodies. We're soul-body unities. The resurrection is a part of our salvation. It's restorative. We're being restored the way God created us as soul-body unities. When we die, we don't spend eternity in heaven. There's a resurrection. We will live on the new earth, you see, and God will be present with His people. Okay, and I believe that's in the person of Jesus Christ, who will be in a body, His resurrection body. I believe when He took on flesh, I believe He did that permanently, and He's going to be among His people. Okay, so that's why the Greeks responded the way they did.
Isn't the gospel totally about the death, burial, and resurrection? That's the gospel itself, what Paul preached and what
In Acts 15, yeah, those are summary statements. It's creedal, actually. I think it's a part of an oral tradition that was being passed around. Paul citing that. Biblical scholars think that that's one of the earliest oral traditions that was being passed around in the churches, and Paul writes it down, 1 Corinthians 15, opening verses. Yeah. Okay, well, thanks so much again for giving me another hour in your evenings when I know you're all tired. I would encourage you, since I didn't have time to talk about this, to read the section of notes on Elisha and the bears, because I get that question raised a lot in the apologetics classes that I teach at Luther Rice, and I think these notes do a good job in uncovering what's really going on there. It's only a couple verses that describe this to us, only a couple verses, so that means there's some background stuff going on. If I could just really short say that these are not a bunch of little kids, okay? They would probably be equivalent to a modern day gang, all right? They are challenging the prophet of God when they say go up, bald head. That requires a little explanation, but I think what they're saying, this is my thinking on this, I think they're wishing him to go up like Elijah did. I think they're wishing his death. Okay, and the curse he calls down comes out of Leviticus, which concerns wild animals. These 2 she-bears come out of the woods. The text says that the bears mauled 42 of them. Now the word translated mauled very well could mean that he scattered them, broke them up, chased them away. That's one possible interpretation of that. So read those notes and see if you can get a better picture of what's going on there. It's not this mean old bald guy calling bears to kill a bunch of little kids. The text doesn't say they were killed. Okay? So take a look at that and see what you think. All right. Thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your evening. And get to sleep in tomorrow too.